thank you both. Adrian, there were so many ways in which what you were saying was resonating with some of the conversations this morning as well.
Yeah, I spent the morning rewriting the presentation.
That's great, so don't
as
worry.
opposed to doing the thing I was supposed to do, but yeah.
Sort of thinking about sort of both different forms of communication, non-human communication as well, and sort of trying to redress the sort of relationships that we establish with the ground. I mean, Djamila, of course, was also referring to this in Afro-Brazilian culture too, and the idea of polluting the water would be polluting oneself. I thought, you know, obviously you were sort of building an argument around this work as well as kind of connecting. It's an object, but it's an object that serves so many purposes. I suppose my question, in a way, I wanted to ask was, how do you feel we can learn from that ourselves? Like, is there any way in which you can kind of apply this in your own practice?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's countless ways in which we can learn from it. One really straightforward way is that the Australian Indigenous form of land management, we need to start learning lessons about like how we relate to fire. I mean, that's the first thing. I think the other thing, I mean, there are more, because there's lots of work taking place on like how fire might be used in completely different ways in Australia. It's very politically sensitive though, because of course it would mean moving away from livestock farming, things with sharp hooves that like push into the ground, because Australian marsupials have really soft feet, so the grasses can grow long and the soil stays soft. But imagine them trying to like shift the Australian diet away from like cows and sheep towards like marsupials or wallabies, right? So there's a big political discussion taking place at the moment. I think the other thing that we can learn, I guess that's what I was trying to allude to at the end, is just on the perspective, like a very personal perspective in terms of like our sensitivity and our perception of the natural world, and to find ways of acknowledging how blind we are to start with. That is to say that, you know, so much of the kind of very, very subtle, like the 1 millimeter shift in the pathway, this tiny little gilla, it's like this size, being understood as so precious. The entire conceptual, philosophical, practical relationship to water that comes along with that, a kind of sensitivity of reading the environment in certain kinds of ways that comes along with that, I think is incredibly important. And I think there's a really interesting discussion around like architecture's role as well, you know, and I think this is why Philippe's work is also so beautiful, is, you know, like understanding architecture as shelter automatically assumes that the environment and nature is something out there, Kind of architecture intervenes to like make us more comfortable in the interior. But in intervening, you construct a concept of nature and the environment as something that you have to be protected from, And so like how architecture can kind of deconstruct this concept of shelter to allow different kinds of environmental conditions to register in our bodies, I think that's a kind of incredible pedagogical project, to sensitize ourselves to the world in a different kind of way.
Exactly, and I thought that was what was so interesting to hear you both following each other, was Philippe, it's sort of an embodied architecture, no? It's inside-out thinking, a completely different approach. It was also reminding me, I mean, I think Joan is one of the few artists who's always been so comfortable talking about myth and ritual and spirituality in her work, and it's something that I think we all have to lessen our Western reserve to these ideas, because clearly this is part of the problem of a divorce in our cultural state. Philippe, I had a more practical question though, which was, I've been talking a lot about this problem in museums of extraordinary waste of resources around climate control and use of spaces, and of course everything you were saying was making me think how, I mean, obviously you were talking about the Luma design of a space, but the idea of designing a museum, its storage, its facilities around this kind of practical approach to what's needed, paper storage, If you've ever had a chance to think about it.
We made a few projects for our museum. None one was realized, but we have this strategy to say, okay, to avoid also to work on gradation, like to say, because you have different level of humidity for or light for conservation of temperature. And so normally, you know, as a designer, you just say, okay, I just design box like that, you know, because I'm in the 20th century, the architect is, the postmodern architect is more like a composition with geometry. So then he called the engineer and said, okay, you have to put this humidity, this temperature inside, and this light. And so it's not his job. But in reality, this is the main job of the architect. This is to manage the climate. So why we cannot start from this, from the humidity rate in the air, from the temperature, and then maybe to do, we did a project like Russian puppet, you know, so outside, of course, it's more warm or more cold, depending of where you are on the planet, or which season, and then more you go inside, more it becomes controlled, and so you can, at the end, maybe you have the La Joconde, you know, because you have the most controlled space, but you can move, you know, from different, from maybe very dry to more humid, or to dark to light. So I like this idea and for the body, it was strong also at the Luma Foundation, because during the visit, during the visit, it was like changing really the sensation of the body. So it was quite strong, you know, to not to be in like a modern, homogeneous white cube. I think this is why I think I learned from post-colonial, or I learned from you know, the critical thinking of the second part of the 20th century, because I don't want to do a science with one target, but I want to do a science with a multitude of targets. So it's why there is always gradation in my work. It's never, you know, okay, this is a good space and the other are not allowed. It's always gradation, and so I think it's for museum, it's also can be like a gradation of temperature, of humidity and light. Yes.
Thank you. Now I know Dorothea's got a question. Is there a mic around? I can give you this one.
First of all, I want to thank you both. I really enjoyed both of your presentations. They were so different, but also relating in very interesting ways. But Adrian, I have a question for you, and maybe slightly banal question. But you told us a little bit about how the opening went, and how this this work was activated by this event that you initiated, but I would be curious to hear how it went on from then onwards, or in other words, like how do you, I mean, you told us how this is so much more than a painting, but how did you prevent from it becoming only a painting then afterwards for the rest of the exhibition, or how was this incredibly rich, I mean, cosmological context provided?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've never curated anything. It's unlikely I'll curate anything again. The project was, the whole exhibition was an attempt to set things in motion. You know, so in the case of this community, their dream was to display the canvas on site, yeah, and to build an economy around it. So one of the projects that will flow out of the triennial will be an attempt to make that a reality. Yeah. So that's one thing. The other thing that we're trying to do afterwards is, and I didn't talk about it because there's so little time, but there is a working group. Yeah. So the working group assembled for 2.5 days just after the opening, and its aim is to write a charter on rights of future generations, drawing on the various sites of social struggle. So for 2.5 days we had Dilma Rousseff, Thabo Mbeki, Francois Vergès, Denise Ferreira da Silva, the economist Ha-Joon Chang, the Australian novelist Richard Flanagan, Gayatri Spivak. There was a kind of a group of the most extraordinary people who met at the beginning, who met during the exhibition, and who will meet again in just a few days' time in Sharjah, and then again afterwards, to make a text. Yeah, the purpose of that text is to collect all of those various sites of social struggle and to try to give them a language that will resonate on the street, but also at the 75th anniversary of the UN in New York in September, and at the Glasgow, Copenhagen, the Glasgow Conference of Parties as part of the UNFCCC framework around climate negotiation in November. And so like, the whole thing is really about how to produce political action through an exhibition. Can I prevent someone coming in there and saying that's just a pretty picture? No. Because it is also just a pretty picture. I mean, and as a curator, I don't think you can determine the kinds of experiences people have. We did our best to kind of contextualize it. There was an incredible film we commissioned by Tuan Andrew Gwynn, which you saw some images for of these portraits at the end, which talks about the history of the canvas and tries to contextualize it in a legal context. And there are aerial images of all the Gila in a separate gallery, and we produce a book. But ultimately, I think the way it will resonate for people is you always have limited control over the way people experience those kinds of works. So I think that was kind of out of my, to some degree, out of the remit of the project. Also, sometimes you kill things by explaining them too much as well.
But just following on that, two questions, right? One to the decision of depositing an artwork at the court of law. Yep. Do you know anything about that? Why they took the decision to deposit a painting?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So there's something really unique that happened in Australia in like through the 1960s and 70s. A series of art centers developed, and so people brought acrylic paints and canvases to these remote communities, and it's such a visually literate society to begin with, and people just started painting, and so of course the history of like Australian Indigenous art, which takes on all these various forms, traditional, non-traditional. There's people working in moving image, all kinds of things at the moment. But the art center, the spin-off of the art center is that it also becomes a space where communities learn to govern themselves. Yeah, that is, they learn to make decisions and to acquire a kind of political autonomy over their own destiny. And so it's kind of astonishing that they would decide to paint proof of intergenerational land tenure. But in Australian Indigenous culture, and especially in these remote communities, painting is the vehicle through which they have a kind of dialogue with the wider world and with Western society. Tommy May, who's one of the artists who I showed in this images, old man with a big Akubra hat, one of the most knowledgeable Indigenous elders in the whole northern section of Australia. And you chat to Tommy May, and he doesn't talk about like Indigenous cosmology. He's like, yeah, I just had a show in Singapore, and I've got a show coming up in New York, and they also see themselves as part of the art world and negotiate in very sophisticated ways through the art world. So in a way, it's both astonishing that they did it, but also it's a medium of translation, yeah, between white world and a black world. And so it kind of makes sense as well. And
then following that, and maybe the personal question, right, is like the charter versus the painting, and following maybe post-human rights of nature, thinking, should we not be more daring in depositing different media to the law than a charter or a text?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the thing about the charter that I think is quite conventional. Yeah. In a way. But what we really wanted to do was to take advantage of linking a kind of like really local scale of like environmental social struggle and to give it a kind to allow those struggles to connect and to circulate at the UN, to circulate in intergovernmental panels on climate change, to circulate at UNCTAD in Geneva, because I think there's one thing to kind of bring the people from the working group and show them the exhibition, yeah? But it's another thing to, where you have to use the medium that works in those forums, yeah, to some degree, yeah? So I think we try to hijack the conventions of those forums, or to infiltrate them, in some way.
Some nods. So thank you all so much tonight. I think there's been so much intersection in these conversations, and I hope that those of you who are continuing the conversation tomorrow morning will bear all of this in mind as we continue. Thank you.
Thank you.